Okay, good morning. It is morning for me anyway. I don't know what time you're watching this. We are going to begin chapter 8 of your text, which deals with child support. This is the chapter everybody always wants to hear about. It is much more straightforward and complex than you think it is. And why do I say that? Well, because child support is primarily determined through a set worksheet that each state adopts. However, there can be ways to modify the child support, and that gets a little bit more into the weeds. So we're going to cover both. We're also going to cover what happens if you don't pay your child support. And we're going to cover how do you stop child support once a child reaches the age of 18. Okay, so let's begin with how we determine child support. And I'm going to rely on the book a great deal for this lecture, so make sure that you are referencing the chapter as you're watching the video. Okay? If you need to stop the video, go get your book, because there's an example in the book that we're going to be referring to. Okay? So, we have federally mandated child support requirements that each state then takes and modifies. So what does that mean? That means the federal government sort of tells each state, this is kind of the bare minimum of what we think children need to grow, and how much each parent needs to be able to contribute to that growth based on their income. Child support is determined by taking the income of mom and the income of dad, adding it together, and then coming up with a dollar amount that is reasonable for people of that income level to pay towards raising their child. The states then take those federal mandates and create state guidelines. Why? Why do they do that? Well, if I make $100,000 in Youngstown, Ohio, that's very different from if I make $100,000 in New York City. In New York City, I'm a pauper. In Niles or Youngstown, I'm living a pretty good life. And so each state takes these guidelines and then puts together a worksheet that is approved by the state legislatures. So let's start on page 193. And in your text it says, look, we look at the total income of both parents. We're not going to say, hey, Dad, you have to pay child support. You make so much money per year, therefore you have to pay this much to the child. It doesn't work that way. What we do is we put together those two incomes. Okay? Now there is a hypothetical, a fact pattern that begins on page 193. And, as a general rule, we want to make sure that children get as much money as their parents can afford without bankrupting the family. So that's what this whole system is designed about, okay? So on page 194, here is your fact pattern. Frederica and Alberto Alvarez live in Lenox, Massachusetts, and have been married for 7 years. They have 2 children, ages 5 and 3. They have agreed upon joint legal custody, which means shared parenting, residential custody with the mother, Frederico. Alberto, as the non-residential parent, will be required to pay Frederica child support for the benefit of the 2 children. Alberto has agreed to carry the children on his health insurance plan, which is available to him through work. He owes no other support obligations, and here's the additional information from the clients that's needed to fill out the child support worksheet. Frederica has a gross income of $420 a week. Alberto has a gross income of $850 a week. Child care costs are $175 a week. Health insurance that Alberto pays is $125, and for dental $10. Okay, we need all of this information because we're going to plug it into the worksheet. Okay, on pages 195 through 198, there is the child support guidelines chart. Now, this is an older chart. They're updated regularly. Where would you find this chart? You would find it in your state's revised code. Within the statutes of each state, the legislature will adopt a child support guidelines sheet. And what you'll see is we start with how much money mom and dad together, the combined income is, and how much they should have to pay. And that's what these columns are. All the way up to, on page 198, combined available income $48.08, and the support would be $918. Okay? This gives you guidelines of how much money should be paid. Now, in Ohio, it's a little bit different, and I'm going to have you look up the Ohio Child Support Guidelines worksheet. But what we have is a range of income, and then for 1 child, 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, how much you should have to pay. I want you to pay attention when you look up the Ohio Child Support Guidelines, because you don't just double the amount of child support for child number 2 and triple it for child number 3, etc. There are certain fixed costs that go into raising a child, and those don't increase by the number of children you have. So for instance, if I have to pay an electric bill for 1 child to keep, the house running, I don't pay double that for 2 children or 3 children or 4 children. So generally there is a recognition that there are certain fixed costs, or if they aren't fixed, they're only minimally increased when you add more children to a household. That's why it looks that way. So when you look at the Ohio Child Support Guidelines, understand that that's why those numbers don't double, triple, quadruple as you go with number of children. Okay? On page 199 of the text, you'll see a sample Child Support Guidelines worksheet. And honestly, this is plug and chug. You put the numbers in, and you end up with what the obligation is. Okay, so you'll start with your gross weekly income. Gross means the total amount before taxes, before retirement's taken out, the total amount that you earn before deductions. Okay? Then you will subtract the child care that's cost, health insurance that gets paid, any dental vision that's get paid, any other support obligations paid. What does that mean? Maybe I have children from another marriage that I have to pay child support for. That number goes in there. Okay, we're going to talk about that later. But understand that the more families of children you have, the less those children will receive, because the pot doesn't get bigger, but it's divided by more children. Okay? And then we do the child support calculation. And you can go down and see how you'll add, you'll subtract, you'll figure out, who has to pay what. And on page 200, it'll end, there's like a little summary. And at the end of every child support guidelines worksheet, there is the same little summary. Okay? Now your text walks you through everything, all of the calculations. I'm not going to ask you to do child support calculations for me, and here's the reason why. Everybody except for one magistrate that I've met in all of these years, does child support calculations through software. So the court uses a specific software to calculate child support that's owed. And they really are basically double checking your work using a program. All the lawyers who do this work buy that same program. And they plug the numbers into the program just like it is on paper, but they plug the numbers into the computer, and the computer does the work. The software does the work. So we could spend hours going through all of the math, but why? Because honestly, what you're going to do is you're going to put the numbers into the program, and the program's going to do the math for you. So child support software is a big contract for whichever software development company it happens to be, because if the state of Ohio says, hey, we're going to use this software program, or if Trumbull County says, we're going to use this software program, every lawyer around has to buy that program. So it's a big deal when a court says, we're going to go ahead and use this program, because it means that those software developers are going to have a lot more people using their program, which means more money for them. Okay? Now, let's say we go through and we do all of these calculations, right? Or we let the software do all the calculations. What if the calculations don't look right? What if, we've added mom and dad's income together, and let's say mom makes $25,000 a year, dad makes $75,000 a year. So together they make $100,000 a year. And dad is the non-residential parent and is going to be paying mom the child support. And there's one child. We can go to the charts, we can figure out how much that obligation is. Does dad have to pay the total amount? No. His percentage of $100,000, which is their combined income, is 75%. So he has to pay 75% of whatever the child support obligation is, and that's what he has to pay to mom. Mom is still responsible for her 25%. She's not going to pay herself that 25%, but dad gets credit for it. That's how that works. Okay? So what if dad says, yeah, but you know what? I have the child 50% of the time. I should get credit for that. I shouldn't have to pay 75% of the child support when I am having the child with me more than what is anticipated between a residential and non-residential parent. I've increased my time with my child, therefore I should not have to pay as much to the residential parent. Most of the time there is merit in that kind of an argument, and the court will listen to it and may grant what's called a deviation from the child support guidelines worksheets. Now you have to say why you are entitled to this deviation, and the most common reason is because I'm spending more time with the child. That's the most common reason for a deviation to be granted. Now, how much of a deviation? Kind of depends. Depends on the judge, depends on the circumstances. But the more time you spend with the child, the greater the deviation is probably going to be. There are other factors the court will take into consideration, like, I have to drive 25 minutes in traffic to get my child. I have to spend more money on gas. So I should be allowed to have a little bit of a deviation. There are things that you can do with costs that will allow you to have a deviation. Okay? Your book goes through on page 204 some of the deviation criteria that some states use. And actually, it's on the bottom of 203 and 204. Extraordinary expenses incurred for the care of physically or mentally disabled child. If you have a disabled child, your child support may be deviated up because it costs more, or maybe deviated down because it costs more. It depends on the argument that you're making to the court. The non-custodial parent's obligation to pay child support to dependents from a previous marriage or relationship. So if you have multiple children from prior relationships, you may be able to tell the court, hey, look, I can't pay all of these obligations and live. Lots of times the courts will say, well, then stop having children. But sometimes a court will find that persuasive and will go ahead and deviate downward. The earning capacity of a parent who has a license to practice medicine and decides to work as a medical assistant may be deemed to be underemployed by the court. Underemployment is a big issue when it comes to child support. What does that mean, underemployment? Some people will choose to work less so that they don't have to pay so much child support. I know that sounds really crappy. There are people who will work under the table so that they don't have to pay child support. There are people who are self-employed who won't report all of their income so that they don't have to pay as much child support. And the court's not stupid. So, if you're living in a nice house, driving a nice car, and saying that you're making $20,000 a year, the court's going to say something smells funny. Underemployment is where you are voluntarily choosing to not make as much money as you are capable of making. And so the court will say, we are going to impute income to you. Impute means we're going to just treat you like you are making as much money as you possibly could. Your book uses the example of a medical assistant versus a medical doctor, right? Let's assume medical doctors make $200,000 a year. Medical assistants make about $30,000 a year. So what the court is going to say is, we're going to impute an additional $130,000 to you for your income, and you're going to pay child support based on that. So people try to get cute sometimes with not having to pay as much child support, and the court generally doesn't buy it. Okay, so that would be considered a deviation, but it would be a deviation upwardly, not downwardly. Okay? Another factor the court may consider is whether other assets are available to the parent but don't appear on the calculation of the child support guidelines. Okay, again, if you're working under the table, if you have set up a trust so that you are not showing that you have income but you're living off of the assets of a trust, the court can take into account the assets of the trust. Okay? Extraordinary expenses incurred by the parents in traveling a significant distance. And again, especially now, you know what gas costs. The court may take into consideration a downward deviation because transportation costs are so high. Okay? Shared custody arrangements where both parents have physical custody of the child for equal time. Okay, well then I shouldn't have to pay 75% of the child support because I have the child half the time. Okay? And so these are some of the factors that the court will consider in deviating from the guidelines. It's kind of like with our standard order of visitation where you can modify it. It's kind of the same thing with deviation, but it's a little tougher with the deviation for child support because the court has an obligation to make sure that the children are supported. And so if you're trying to wiggle down the number, the court isn't going to be real happy about that. Okay? Now, The next thing your book goes into is how do we modify these child support orders, right? Let's say our divorce is final, and the non-residential parent gets a significant raise at work and is making more money. What can I do about that? Well, I can go back to the court and I can file for a modification of child support. The standard that is used is that there must be a substantial change in income in order for there to be a modification. And what that substantial is a 3% change in the amount of money that would have to be paid. Now, you may think 3% is not a ton of money. It is. 3% is a big deal. Because in order for you to get from one level of child support to another, you generally have to make more than $10,000 or $15,000 a year. Okay, so that's substantial. If you go back and you just say, he got a 25-cent an hour raise, the court's going to say, get out of here. It's not substantial. You're wasting our time. Okay? Now, this can work the opposite direction, too. What if I lose my job and I have to pay child support? What am I going to do? Well, I have to have it modified. And by the way, the longer I wait to have it modified, the worse it is for me, because interest is going to start accruing. I'm going to be coming in arrears of my child support. I'm going to be behind on my child support. So the quicker you do this, the better. There's two ways you can do this. You can either go through the court or you can go through the Child Support Enforcement Agency. That is called an administrative way of taking care of things. You can either do it administratively or you can do it through the courts. Administratively, sometimes takes a little bit longer, but you don't have to pay for court costs or an attorney. If you do it through the courts, it's more expensive, but it gets done quicker. Those are the two pros and cons of modification of child support. But the problem is, if you're in arrears, you can run into some real problems. So before we talk about what arrears are and how all of this works, or how arrears can accrue, let's talk about how all this works. Okay? If a child support order goes into place, let's say we're in the middle of a divorce, and the order goes on that I have to pay $400 every 2 weeks for my kids. It's going to take some time from that order to make it from the court to the Child Support Enforcement Agency, who is then going to contact my employer, who is then going to garnish my wages, and then the money is going to get sent to the state, who's then going to send it back to the county, who then is going to send it to... You can see how this could take some time, right? So off the bat, I'm going to be in arrears. That's the word we use for behind. I'm behind on my child support before I even get started. One thing you can do to alleviate that is make cash payments through your attorney to the residential parent or whomever you're paying the child support to. And the attorney can document that, and then that documentation can go to the Child Support Enforcement Agency, and they won't show that you're behind. Don't just give the money to the residential parent, because then it's considered a gift, and it's not considered a payment towards your arrears. A lot of people get stung that way. So you need to have a paper trail, and it needs to go to the Child Support Enforcement Agency. If you are in arrears, if you don't pay your child support and you're significantly in arrears, what can happen, and by that, that's usually meant by, depending on whoever the caseworker is, 6 months. If you're 6 months behind or more, the Child Support Enforcement Agency has some authority to take you back to court for non-payment. They can take your driver's license administratively so that you can't drive. They can even file a criminal action against you for non-payment of child support. And it's actually a felony. It's a really big deal. Every prosecutor's office has a prosecutor that's assigned specifically for felony non-payment of child support. So there are lots of quivers in the arrow of the Child Support Enforcement Agency to make you pay your child support. You want to make sure you're not in arrears. Okay? The thing is, when you're in arrears, that dollar amount that you're behind, interest accrues at a rate of 18%. So not only are you behind, it's like a high interest credit card. You're never going to catch up. So you really need to make sure you're doing everything you can not to be in arrears. And the other thing is, if you have to modify your child support because you've lost your job or you've had to take a job where you pay less, make sure you do that right away, because those arrears really add up quickly, and at 18% interest, it's going to be really, really tough to get those paid off. So if you look on page 210 of your book, there's a whole list of means of enforcement that the Child Support Enforcement Agency can use to try to get you to come back and make your payments for your child. There are people who are paying child support because their arrears were so large and the interest accrued in such great amount. Their kids are in their 20s and they're still paying child support because they got so far behind. So it's a really important thing that you impress upon your clients. You've got to stay on top of your child support payments. Okay? Now, what about the connection between visitation and child support? Remember, I told you this was going to be a deal. Lots of people will say, well, he hasn't paid his child support, and so I'm not going to let him see the kids. You can't do that. They are two completely separate concepts. And as logical as it may sound, you can't do it. The only situation where that might occur is at the beginning of the establishment of child support in juvenile court. And that's your tease, because next chapter is on juvenile court. We'll get into that next time. Okay? We've already talked about the fact that if you have children from another relationship and you're paying child support for them, the later children get paid less. It's just how the child support calculation is made. If there is a new spouse and that spouse has money that they're contributing to the income of the household, we do not count that. Okay? We get into this situation a lot where, let's say, mom is the residential parent, dad's a non-residential parent. Mom remarries, and now dad says, well, why do I have to pay all this child support? She has more than enough money from her new husband. The court doesn't look at it that way. That's not the new husband's responsibility. That's your responsibility. And so we're not going to count that new husband's income. But another situation that regularly happens is mom remarries and then cuts back from full-time to part-time work. And husband says, you know what, why am I having to pay all this child support because she's working part-time? She should be working full-time. She has the degree, she has the ability, she's voluntarily underemployed. And that's the situation that we were talking about before, where the court may impute income and it will affect the amount of child support that gets paid. Okay? Your book goes into some other now kind of interesting things. Non-biological parents' duty to pay child support. Let's say that I am a step parent and I have raised a child for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I've thought that these children are my children, but they're not. The court is going to say, you know what, the kids think you're their parent, you're the only parent you've ever had, you're going to be compelled to pay child support. And that's called equitable estoppel. That's when the court says, you know, we get that this is a gray area, but we're dealing with children and we're always going to err on the side of making sure children have the money they need to live. If you have always been dad, guess what? You're dad now. And that's the way that's going to work. There's a case of Nygaard versus Nygaard that deals with that in the book. Feel free to read that because that may give you a little more insight into this. Okay. What happens when the child reaches the age of 18? How do we terminate this? It doesn't automatically terminate. Child support by statute terminates when the child turns 18 or graduates from high school, whichever happens later. So if you have a child that turns 18 in the middle of their senior year, child support is still going to continue until they finish high school. Okay? Conversely, if you have a child who doesn't turn 18 until August after they graduate from high school, child support's not going to terminate until August. Okay? It doesn't automatically terminate, though. And so the parent who is paying child support has to petition the court to say, look, my child has reached the age of majority and has graduated from high school. Please stop child support. That doesn't automatically stop the child support from happening. The court will hold a hearing, and the court will call the Child Support Enforcement Agency in to do an audit to say, okay, did this obligor, did this person who's supposed to pay child support, are they in arrears? Are they fully paid? And according to the audit, that will determine how much more child support you have to pay. Even the most vigilant obligor who has paid their child support, they think on time, typically has an arrearage. It's weird. But, you know, until Child Support Enforcement Agency signs off and says all the child support's paid, all the child support's not paid. So it's important to have that hearing as soon as possible. If you know your child has turned 18 in January and is graduating in May, in January you file for that hearing because it's going to take you 5 or 6 months to get before the court. So let's say you've been paying child support after your child has turned 18. Do you get a refund? No, you don't. If the party that you've paid the child support to is so inclined, they can return it to you. There's no obligation. You can sue them in small claims court. Good luck. Usually doesn't work. Okay? So it's really important that you are your own advocate if you have to pay child support for termination of child support. It just is. Now, is there an obligation to send your kid to college? Is there an obligation with child support that, you know, you do anything past the age of majority? No, there isn't. If you make an agreement with your former spouse or with the other parent that you're going to pay 50% of college or whatever, fine. But that's not part of this system. If you have a child with special needs, however, there may be an obligation to continue child support. And I don't even want to say may. There usually is an obligation that you pay child support if that child can't support themselves. You do get a set-off for Social Security or whatever benefits that the child gets when they reach the age of 18, but you don't, there may be an obligation that still is outstanding. So that's really the only situation where after the age of majority, the court is going to compel that child support continue to be paid. Okay? All right, there's a lot in this chapter, a lot of math and a lot of in the weeds stuff. I'm just trying to give you the overview of the system. I'm going to have you look up Ohio's child support guidelines worksheets. I'm not going to have you work one because, again, you don't have the software to do that. But it is important that you understand that this is an important component of the whole divorce process, that the child support guidelines calculations must be included in a separation agreement when you have children. And either that separation agreement is something you've agreed to or it is going to be ordered by the court. Child support is a must. It's got to be put in there. Okay, there is one more thing that I do want to tell you. If you're not working, you still owe child support. There's a minimum of $50 a month child support that must be paid. So even if you're unemployed, you still have to pay child support. It's important to the court to make sure that the children that they retain jurisdiction over have what they need. And child support is one of those things. Okay? All right, look for the discussion, look for an essay question, and I'm going to give you some vocabulary too. Okay? All right, thank you very much.